Let's talk about aspect warriors, some advanced technology, and some towering wraith constructs, with a tier list of Aeldari units in Warhammer 40K, and which ones are strongest and weakest. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Aeldari, and in this video I thought we'd do a quick overview of the entirety of Index Aeldari, rating the units into 5 different tiers of their rough strength. Aeldari have definitely been having a rather good time of it since 10th edition came out. When the indexes first dropped, it was clear that they were going to be one of the very strongest factions in the game, and by quite a wide margin over most. And even despite some emergency nerfs from Games Workshop to their most standout units, they still seemed to absolutely run rampant over competitions for the next month or so, clocking up a pretty ridiculous win rate of around about 68% on average. Since the balanced data slate though, Games Workshop did hit basically most of the Aeldari tournament picks really quite hard, often with nerfs in around about the 10 to 20% range, and a few core game rule mechanics changes that really hurt the faction as well. Even despite all of that, no one's really feeling too bad for the Space Elves, seeing as they still seem to be the strongest faction in the game, but with a win rate of 57%, there's a lot more catchable for most of the other factions now, as opposed to just being ridiculously ludicrously ahead. They still do seem to be taking home more event wins than just about any other faction, only really Chaos Space Marines giving them any sort of competition on that sort of front. And in this video I thought we'd go over some of the units that seem to be getting used the most in tournaments, and why some are getting picked more regularly and others are getting left on the table. Tier lists in 40k are always a little bit arbitrary, and I'm sure there'll be some debate as to whether certain units could be maybe a tier up or tier down. It always does depend somewhat on army and context, so definitely treat this as a rough and ready guide, and there's definitely lower tier units that could be absolutely the right choice in certain armies. This one's broadly based on the units that get played the most in competitive Aeldari lists at the moment, plus a community channel poll as well, to help add a little bit more nuance. In any case, let's jump straight into the many units that the Eldar can field, and in this video I've chosen to rank them in 5 different tiers, starting with the weakest, and we'll move towards the strongest. First up, in tier 5 I thought we'd start with the weakest or single most overshadowed datasheets in the codex in my opinion. And starting out, we have the unfortunate case of the Storm Guardians, 115 points for basic Aeldari troopers with a 4+ save, that just seem to be rather weirdly pointed when compared to their Guardian Defender kin, or basically most of the other units in the index. Their standard combat weapons only have a pretty pathetic Strength 3, AP 0 and Damage 1, so for a unit that's sort of supposed to be a more dedicated melee one, they really don't do that role well. Perhaps a bit more of their value coming from the hidden fusion guns and power weapons within the unit. The scale platform does give them a 5+ invulnerable save, which helps a little bit, though I wouldn't say it gets them to the point where they're a durable unit for the cost, not when you've got options like Wraithguard to put on the table. And it just feels like if you wanted to take a unit of these guys, you'd probably usually be better with the Guardian Defenders, what with their actually somewhat threatening Shuriken catapults, plus their nice ability to farm up some Fate dice if they're on objectives. Otherwise, for some slightly more niche Forge World choices, the Titans are never really going to be top competitive picks unless Games Workshop messes up somehow. It's not generally their idea that they want one single Titan to be the best army list that you can field. So I'd very much rate the Revenant and Phantom Titans basically in their own class of not really going to be very relevant picks. The big Phantom Titan is 2,100 points, so you can't even field it in more standard games of Warhammer 40k. And for the smaller Revenant one, while it does have 2 enormously powerful guns, it perhaps just suffers from only being able to take down 2 targets a turn at max, even if it manages to do that. I feel like you're probably going to be better off with its points in Wraith Knights, and realistically its points in much smaller Aeldari vehicles. You could get a big cluster of Hornets and Warwalkers with Bright Lances for this, moving out and taking down a whole bunch of tank targets. I still have almost enough points left over for a Wraith Knight. Otherwise, the Nightwing is the 412 Flyer. Not really too much to say about that one. For 150 points, it just seems like Crimson Hunters and Hemlock Wraith Fighters, but worse. And finally, in the bizarrely overcosted section is the Webway Gate. This is 220 points, and it's just hugely expensive for a static unit delivery system. I feel like its rules were kind of interesting in 9th edition, where you could teleport some scary units into the midfield, but for 220 points it's just nowhere near worth it, and it's not like Aeldari units don't have good movement characteristics for the most part to get them where they need to go. Moving on to slightly more positive things though, here in tier 4 we've got the datasheets that I consider a bit overshadowed, and units that I'd say are typically going to be a lot more rare choices to see on the table than some of the others. First up, we've got the Aeldari Flyers in the Crimson Hunter and the Hemlock Wraith Fighter. They're around about 160 points, and they need to start off the board as per 40k's current flyer rules. And with the pivoting thing, their movement's just a lot less flexible than a lot of other things in the codex. The firepower definitely isn't awful for the cost, and you do get some good mobility with it. They make great use of the battle host rerolls with the Bright Lances and things. Out of the two, I think I'm a bit more of a fan of the Crimson Hunter with its +1 to hit and wound against fly targets. That could make the Bright Lancers even nastier. I feel like the Crimson Hunter in particular isn't unusable in an army list, but maybe just doesn't really feel very necessary when you've got quite a lot of fast-moving Bright Lance platforms on the ground, and they don't have to be locked into flight paths or locked into starting off the board. Next up, a few more slightly more niche Forge World tanks. The Warp Hunter, Scorpion, and Cobra I feel like are generally alright, but just tend to be a bit worse than the other options out there. I feel like there's just quite a lot of choices for Eldari high power anti-tank weapons, and you've got good competition from War Walkers, Fire Prisms, and other Forge World things like, say, the Lynx or the Hornets, and overall I'd say they're typically going to be better choices than these three. Prince Iriel of Iandin is 100 points. His trick is to redeploy some units, but you do so before the first turn roll, so you're not doing it with prior knowledge as to where your opponent's going to be. Can still be interesting enough to get some positioning advantages on the opponent though, if there is the chance that if they go first then they're going to win a very favourable little matchup that you've set up. Otherwise though, I just don't really feel he does that much to justify that 100 point investment. His melee's alright at strength 6 and AP 3, and it's got a slightly more limited unit pool to attach to. I feel like if you're probably taking an Autark, it's going to be better to take one of the standard variants that rustles you up command points all game long. Next up, there's the Warlocks and their Conclaves, which tend to be kind of rare picks as well. The Warlock Conclaves just maybe aren't all that tough for the cost, though maybe could be alright to bodyguard a Farseer if you desperately didn't want one just on its own. I feel like they don't really add all that much protection for the points that you pay for them though, and I'd be a bit more tempted by Guardian Defenders for the Fate dice if you wanted to guard a Footseer, or a Wind Rider squad for a Jetseer. Otherwise, for the ones that can join units, the Skyrunner Warlock has an okay buff to Wind Rider's damage or defense, I suppose. Still maybe feels like it's a bit more of an investment than you really need though, compared with just putting the points towards, say, another squad of Wind Riders. Probably competition's also an issue as well. There's loads of great HQs that the Eldar have between Farseers, Autarks, and a whole cast of usable unique characters as well. I feel like these guys are rarely going to get a look in. Next up, for a few slightly lesser played Phoenix Lords, I've chosen to rank Irilith, Morgan Ra, and Jane Zar here. Jane Zar's 105 points, gives the Banshees a +1 to hit, some mass strength 6 attacks, plus heroic intervention. Basically just makes a Banshee squad a little bit better, which maybe isn't the worst in the world. They'll certainly be able to take out things like Space Marines a lot better, but still doesn't really threaten more tough stuff like, say, enemy tanks or vehicles. Morgan Ra chips in with a whole bunch of strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 shooting attacks in a Dark Reaper squad. Giving them +1 to hit for a 2+ ballistic skill isn't bad as well, could be efficient enough on a big ranked up unit of them. And his bonus to killing injured units is alright, though I feel like it's a little situational, and often you're going to be firing against more intact stuff. I think it's just kind of so-so for 130 points though, and his melee profile is a bit wasted in a fragile-ish ranged unit that you don't really want too near the enemy lines. Out of these, I'd say Irilith is perhaps the one that I'd be most tempted to rank in tier 3, so probably top of this tier or lower down there. It's got quite a nice elite killing spear attack with 3 attacks at damage 4, and gives the Shadow Spectres +1 to hit for the rest of their attacks, though in all honesty I feel like for a disruption type unit that's going to be hitting and running and skirmishing with enemies, you might just be better to have another unit of Shadow Spectres as opposed to upgrading to their fancy leader. Sticking with the Forge World things, next is the Scathach Wraith Knight, the one with the Death Shrouds or the Inferno Lancers. I feel like this one caught some reactive nerfs when the regular Wraith Knight went up, Games Workshop nerfing towering things, though it wasn't really the guns and profiles of this guy that were causing problems, not compared with the heavy Wraith cannons of the regular Wraith Knight. I feel like it probably doesn't do quite enough for 490 points versus the other options, at least the regular Wraith Knight at least has the big plays that you can do, feeding in those Fate Die 6s to auto wound on a 6 with the heavy Wraith cannons, and get a whole bunch of devastating wounds on one hard target. Next up is the Shadowseer for 60 points, who can support the Harlequin troops. They give them really quite a long threat range, re-rolling advances, and advance and charge. That means they've got a fairly serious threat range between the 8 inches that they move at base, plus those 2 special rules. Probably needs to be in a bigger Harlequin unit to really justify the Shadowseer as an upgrade though, I think. And when they get there, they perhaps have the disadvantage of just not really doing as much as you'd hope they'd do when they get into combat. AP1 and damage 1 attacks only achieve so much, even with the +1 to wound. Not unusable, though I'd probably go for the Troop Master's devastating wounds as the first port of call. Next up, we've got the Corsairs. The Void Scarred are the Elites version at 90 points or 180 for 10 of them, and the Void Reavers are 70 or 140. I feel like these guys are interesting enough little kill team mixed units, but are just a bit overcosted. Even with some buried special weapons in the unit, I feel like 14 points per model is quite a lot to ask for the regular Void Reavers. and 18 for the Void's Guard, even if they do get a few nice advantages like ignoring cover and cancelling one failed save per turn. Perhaps the biggest draw might be the Scouts keyword so they can get into the midfield, though I feel like if you want early game board presence, Rangers might just be best for that, doing it for only 55 points for an infiltrate unit. Lastly, for tier 4, we've got a couple of the Aspect Warriors. The Shining Spears at 120 points are just very, very pricey per individual jet bike. Really not very tough per point at all, even with a -1 to hit and an invulnerable save. And for that kind of points cost, they need to hit kind of spectacularly hard when they do land a charge. Unfortunately, while their laser lances shoot at strength 6 at range, they are still strength 4 in melee, which I think is a bit killer for them, really. Again, even if they do have lance for a +1 to wound on the charge. It means they'll do a fairly good job of killing standard-sized Space Marines, but are going to just feel like they lack a bit of punch for the points cost that they are whenever they're attacking things that are toughness 5 or above. The fly keyword in 10th edition doesn't really help them out too much as well, having to go around terrain rather than go straight through it, say like Warp Spiders or Shadow Spectres, who are quite popular Eldar fast attack type units. Finally, for tier 4, we've got the Howling Banshees, 85 points or 170 for a squad of 10. Their main thing is to move extra fast with advance and charge, strike with a whole flurry of power weapon attacks that again are going to be quite good against things like standard Space Marines with toughness 4, but not having the +1 to wound that they used to have in 9th edition means they're not as good against tougher things. The fights first that they get is kind of nice, but they do die very, very easily to Overwatch or just incidental small arms fire for the points cost that they are. And perhaps more so than the other aspects, they're going to be incentivized to throw themselves forward into combat, and for their points cost, I don't feel like they're always going to be able to do enough to drag down enough enemy units before they get killed fairly quickly. Moving onwards and upwards, these are the datasheets that I consider maybe a bit better than the last lot. Fairly usable Aeldari units, though probably not quite as standout. I wouldn't expect to see as many of these in competitive Aeldari lists, not compared with tiers 2 and 1. But I think a few of them are pretty reasonable choices to fill certain niche roles, or maybe have like one unit in the army of. First up, there's the Harlequin Voidweaver at 125 points. This one's a toughness 6, 6 wound model with a 4+ invulnerable save that maybe isn't particularly hard to kill for the cost it is. It does hit really quite hard with that prismatic cannon plus its 2 bonus shuriken cannons it has. The prismatic cannon's quite nice for the big battle host type rerolls, and then getting 2 shuriken cannons compared with say a war walker I think is quite nice. I'd say its main issue is being slightly more expensive than the war walker and a fair bit easier to kill given that it doesn't get a -1 to wound. So compared with those sort of things, you really have to want the extra shuriken damage, and want a vehicle that's very skewed into damage dealing rather than defense, perhaps even for Aeldari. Still solid enough though, I've seen a few of these used in tournament lists. Next up we've got the Falcon Grav tank for 140 points. It's a fairly reasonable medium tank for the Eldar. Defense isn't really that exciting, though it is quite fast, but it does hit quite hard with a pulse laser, maybe with a Bright Lance as backup to use the battle host rerolls, and its main job is to deliver a scary unit and deal damage with it. I feel like perhaps the single most interesting unit for it might be the Fire Dragons, as basically when you get them out, you get to reroll the wound roll against the target that the tank has also shot at. Really quite nice for Fire Dragons with some fantastically dangerous guns, but ones with only strength 9, so they're going to struggle to punch up against tough stuff. Definitely could be pretty reasonable with several of the other aspects as well though. The Wave Serpent's 120 points, and for an Aeldari vehicle, it's fairly tough for the cost. Toughness 9, 13 wounds, and a 5+ invulnerable save is quite nice, and it's basically functioning as the transport for bigger squads if you want them, say maybe a big unit of Dire Avengers with Athaman, or delivering something like some melee aspects into combat. Otherwise it gets a twin-linked weapon on the turret, so it can still chip in a little bit to ranged firepower, plus gets a single once per game mortal wound damage attack from discharging the Serpent Shield. Could be handy to kill another model or two in a pinch. Next up, the Lynx is one of the better Forge World tank destroyers. The Pulsar's 4 attacks at strength 16, AP 3 and damage D6, which is quite nice, plus a backup Bright Lance if you'd like that one. Again, compared with a bunch of the other Aeldari tanks, it doesn't do too terribly for defense. 16 wounds with a 5+ invulnerable save I'd say is better than most, and quite nice as you can fire it at least a fairly long range as well. Still going to be competing against things like Hornets and War Walkers and Fire Prisms and things, but I feel like it holds up at least fairly well. Probably could be towards the top of this tier. Next up, we've got the Mighty Wraith Knight, who not so long ago would have been absolutely ranking right at the top of this tier list, but it perhaps stuck its head above the parapet just a little bit too much, and Games Workshop did hit it with multiple nerfs all at once. It's now 510 points, so it's really quite a princely investment if you do want one in the army. It can no longer overwatch, which was quite a big use for it to get an auto 6 with that Wraith Cannon, and now the devastating wounds don't count as mortal wounds anymore. It means that you can only use the Wraith Cannon against one single target, as opposed to having it overflow to multiple models, potentially wiping out entire squads in one shot. Even despite all this though, I'd certainly not say it's unplayable when paired with a Farseer. It is pretty tough at toughness 12, a 2+ save and -1 damage. A Farseer nearby could give it a -1 to wound, which is kind of brutal on that kind of target. The heavy Wraith Cannons still do some fairly long range and pretty scary damage outputs with the Battle Host rerolls built in, and you can still punch an automatic 6 into the devastating wounds thing to just crack straight through an enemy vehicle's invulnerable saves. Still pretty usable overall. I feel like it's perhaps just a bit of a shame that the Sword and Shield version of the Wraith Knight doesn't have a different data sheet and points cost, as it really is paying for the sins of the heavy Wraith Cannon version. Next up, we've got the Wraith Lord for 160 points. The Wraith Knight's little brother is toughness 11, a 2+ save and 10 wounds. Fairly tanky, but still maybe a little bit middling at 160 points. I wouldn't say it's standout tough. As ever, it's probably going to be most popular with a pair of Bright Lances with the Battle Host rerolls for some fairly savage anti-tank damage, and then can mix it up in melee with a Ghost Glaive as well, plus has some close range wrist guns. If it does manage to destroy any units, it's got the potential to generate some fate dice, which I guess is a little bit of added hidden value. Overall, between all that, I feel like it's pretty playable, though not standout. I feel like it's not the worst to have one or two marching up the battle line alongside other units, though some games against the wrong anti-tank weapons it's just going to get shot dead. The 4-12 brother of the Wraith Lord is the Wraithseer. This one's got a fairly similar profile overall, and I'd say more gets a few side grades on the standard Wraith Lord. Having a 5+ invulnerable save is kind of nice, though some of the time it's not going to be relevant given a 2+ base save. Its melee profile isn't quite as good against heavies, but gets anti-infantry 2+, which is quite nice. It certainly does a bit more against hordes, but it trades off those benefits against only having one heavy weapon rather than two. At the moment, I think I'd be a bit more tempted by the Wraith Lord over the Wraithseer. The special rule also does seem a little bit more helpful for the Wraith Lord as well, as the Wraithseer does battle shock things. Next up for 110 points are the Guardian Defenders. I feel like these guys are reasonable enough choices to bodyguard a foot Farseer on a home field objective, or maybe even a foot Autarch, sitting around and at least putting a fair few wounds on the table for Aeldari, taking some pot shots with a hidden Bright Lance in the unit with the Battle Host rerolls, and perhaps most importantly having the chance to generate some fate dice. It does maybe feel like 110 points is perhaps a bit of an overcommitment to an objective. You might just be able to hold it with some genuinely scary firepower units. But I feel like if you've got a character that you want to guard on foot, then these guys are pretty reasonable to have around. Next up, the Striking Scorpions with soon to have shiny new models are 75 points or 150. I'd probably be more tempted to run them in the slightly smaller squad of 5 though. They're one of the two main Aeldari infiltrator units, where I guess they're competing for the Rangers with this. Compared with Rangers, they're a bit better armoured and have a 3+ armour save, and actually somewhat melee capable. 4 attacks each with sustained hits, and their Manda Blasters grant them devastating wounds against anything that isn't a monster or vehicle. The Scorpion's Claw and the Exarch I feel like is the real value of the unit, getting you Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 2 attacks that's really quite good for bullying Space Marines. Overall, just for how cheap they are, I'd probably be a bit more tempted by Rangers for the 55 points for starting the midfield type units, though I feel like a single unit of Striking Scorpions isn't the worst idea in the world. If they do put themselves in a place where they manage to kill an enemy unit that's moving for some midfield objectives or something, then the extra points could easily be justified. Next up, the Dark Reapers are 80 points for 5 of them, or 160 per 10. They're way cheaper than the unit used to be in previous editions, such as 8th and 9th edition, though the Reaper launchers maybe aren't just all around quite as scary or devastating as they used to be. They're generally striking with either a single shot at Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 2, or 2 at Strength 5, AP 1 and Damage 1. They ignore cover and they ignore ballistic score modifiers as well, which are two nice advantages, and they are quite nice being some fragile ranged infantry that can actually use some very good range to try and hang back and stay safe. Perhaps the biggest draw to the unit might be Exarchs with Tempest launchers. A couple of those could do some pretty seriously nasty work in whittling down enemy light objective holders and could really disrupt their game plans, meaning that they have to redistribute troops to go back to a home field objective or something. Or otherwise, I guess the Exarch's actual missile launcher that they can get is rather nice with the Battle Host rerolls. Overall, at 80 points for 5, I think they're pretty usable. And at 16 points and really quite long range, they feel just a little bit more survivable than a bunch of the other aspects perhaps. Next up, we've got the Harlequin troops, 15 points per model, and they come in interesting squad sizes of 5, 6, 11 or 12 to represent the box and whether or not you build the troop master out of them. They get a 4+ invulnerable save and objective control 1. They're fairly fast with their 8-inch move and get +1 to wound on the charge, though I'd say their damage output is just a little bit mid. Strength 4 AP -1 attacks, plus a few scattered special pistols in the units. Overall I'd rate them as kind of fine, but just maybe not standout. If they did manage to get first strike on say something like a small squad of Space Marines or some enemy lighter infantry, they'll definitely do work, and could potentially be joined by a Troop Master for some devastating wounds to help them punch up at least a little bit. The Biker Harlequins are the Skyweavers. These guys are 95 points for 2 of them, or 190 for 4. They are fast bikers and have a fair bit of threat between their gun and their primary weapon, but just aren't really all that tough for the cost with just 3 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save each. Pretty easy to take down with both volume fire and anti-tank weapons. For their big gun, they get either a haywire cannon or a shuriken cannon. I'll probably be a bit more tempted by the shurikens unless the meta is very vehicle heavy. And then they either choose between some Strength 7, AP2 and Damage 2 Star Bowlers to shoot, or some Strength 5, AP1 Damage 2 Glaives with 4 attacks. Overall I'd say they're okay skirmishers. They will do some good enough damage to medium infantry, but just maybe don't have all that much special to sell them versus some of the other Eldar fast units that do some very nasty things. Sticking with the Harlequins, and next up we have the Starweaver for 80 points. I feel like it's usable enough to get Harlequins from A to B. 80 points for a very fast moving transport at toughness 6, 6 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable isn't too bad durability at all. It comes with a couple of shuriken cannons, has firing deck 6 for taking pistol pot shots if that makes sense, and has quite a fun re-embark infantry rule if you happen to be out of combat, potentially after you've wiped a unit in melee. I think it could be reasonable enough to get troops where they need to be, though Harlequins overall I feel like aren't usually going to be in positions where it's usually going to be a good idea to run entire armies of Starweavers and troops. Next up for some more Phoenix Lords, we've got Karandras at 100 points. He's quite a scary threat to have in an infiltrating unit of striking scorpions and makes them quite a lot more savage, both in terms of their own damage output plus his of course. He gives the entire squad a +1 to hit, and then when they make a charge they get critical hits on a 4+, which means that their sustained hits go off on that. And between the +1 to hit and that boost, it's basically an extra 60% worth of melee damage out of the squad, never mind his own attacks which are quite nasty at strength 8, AP3 and damage 2. His own personal devastating wounds work against monsters and vehicles as well. Overall, I think it's interesting enough to make a striking scorpions unit a considerably nastier threat against enemy elite infantry and things. Still probably not going to be punching up against monsters and vehicles too reliably though. It does basically feel like paying a premium to make the scorpions unit a bit more problematic for the opponent and a bit less of a incidental threat that they might be able to ignore. Again though, probably one that's worth weighing up against yet another squad of striking scorpions on the board for yet more infiltrating board control. Baharoth is 125 points for Swooping Hawk's Phoenix Lord. He chips into the squad's firepower with a Strength 6, AP1 and Damage 2 Las Blaster, and could help make them strong enough to bully a lighter unit in melee as well. He gets 6 attacks at Strength 5, AP2 and Damage 2 with sustained hits. Otherwise there's a +1 to hit for the unit, which is quite nice with all those shots, that doesn't help out the lethal hits at all. And perhaps his biggest draw is the move shoot move that he gets to keep his fragile units safe. Means that you could have a big squad of swooping hawks pinging in and out of terrain at a fairly safe range, taking big pot shots at the enemy, and still have the option of sky leaping on and off the board. Overall doesn't seem awful and feels like you could have some pretty powerful gamey movement shenanigans going on if you paid the premium. Could still potentially come unstuck against enemies with just excessive movement or a bit of ignores line of sight firepower though to drastically cut the unit down a bit, and the damage output is not going to be all that serious against anything with high saves. Next up for a few more characters, there's the Harlequin Troop Master, 55 points to basically give yourself a bunch more volume attacks and devastating wounds to the unit, plus he's got the option to automatically make a fate dice of 6 if it's used on himself, maybe with a fusion pistol's wound roll or something. Probably overall I'd say a little bit better than the Shadow Seer perhaps. I feel like a Harlequin unit having devastating wounds from not having devastating wounds is going to be quite a big difference as to how much damage they get through against things with better saves. Particularly on a big ranked up unit of 11 or something, you might be looking at 5 or 6 devastating wounds out of them, and that's quite a nice way to start a combat, never mind their +1 to wound damage. Next we've got the Autarch Skyrunner at 90 points. He feels like he's mainly going to be a command point battery, but also help out with his damage profile a bit in the later game once he's been generating command points for the first few turns. It's perhaps a bit weird that he can only join Wind Riders or run solo. Kind of odd that Games Workshop didn't let him join Shining Spears given his big laser lance energy. He could potentially make the Wind Riders auto advance 6 inches. so that would stop them charging and him using his laser lance. He does get a bit of personal damage threat with the strength 4 laser lance with a +1 to wound, though I feel like it's just a combat weapon that I might have expected to have a few more pips of strength even with the lance keyword. Maybe a strength 6 would have made him a lot more tempting. I think the command points are solid enough though, but I feel like most people are going to be tempted by one of the other autarchs in preference. Finally, we've got the Vizarch for 90 points, probably the choice out of the Inari I'd rate the lowest, maybe a little bit low on tier 3, could have been a high tier 4 choice perhaps. He brings some relatively strong precision melee to the table, 5 attacks at strength 5, AP 4 and damage 2, and he gets to pick a different rule to boost it each turn, either sustained hits to devastating wounds or lethal hits, whichever is going to be most helpful. Perhaps just as importantly, he also grants fights first to the unit. That could be potentially really quite nice on a Harlequin troop or a squad of Drukhari witches maybe, makes them a lot more resilient to being taken out in combat without going down swinging, and he can make a bit of an Eldar Death Star type unit by joining Ivrain's squad as well, potentially an awful lot of threat in one squad that he might be able to do some powerful things with. Still though, maybe just feels a bit less necessary than the two other Inari unique characters. Moving on, we get to Tier 2, perhaps some slightly stronger Aeldari datasheets that I'd expect to see in tournament lists a bit more, but again maybe not quite as truly stand out as the stuff that I've chosen to rank in Tier 1. Starting out, we've got the Fire Dragons, which I might have been a little bit more tempted to put somewhere between borderline low Tier 2 or high Tier 3. I feel like for 85 points for the unit though, they are pretty threatening, fairly uncomplicated, dedicated anti-elite or anti-tank fire. The strength 9 of their fusion guns means they wound elites on 3s or better, which is quite nice, whereas they will be wounding most vehicles on a 5+, which isn't ideal, but having a big damage characteristic of potentially melt a 3 plus d6 is really quite nasty, and they do have the assault keywords to get within half range if possible. The Firepike really helps out the unit against heavies as well, that'll be wounding a lot of things on a 3+ as it's strength 12, and they also innately gets 2 reroll wounds and damage results of 1 against monsters and vehicles as well, just cranking up their threat that little bit more. Overall, they will definitely be quite swingy, but if you can get them within melter range, they average something like 12 or 13 wounds against a toughness 10 vehicle with a 3+ save. They are probably going to need some sort of delivery system to do that though, maybe a Wave Serpent or a Falcon. The Falcon in particular could be quite nice though, as it could allow you to reroll wound rolls. Overall, not too bad for 85 points though. Definitely a unit that threatens the potential to earn back its points in a single round of shooting, although quite likely to get removed by the enemy in revenge. Next up, for 75 points or 150 points, we've got the Swooping Hawks. These guys are fairly fast moving deep strikers with their las blasters with a whole bunch of volume fire, getting lethal hits on 6s to stack some saves. They've got the Sky Leap ability to allow them to jump on and off the board, repeatedly deep striking if it makes sense. That's very nice for doing things like backfield enemy secondaries, or ones where you have to come down and either do an action or jump into the corners of the board or something. And overall, I feel like they're quite a nice budget option compared with the perhaps more premium Eldar support type units of the Warp Spiders and the Shadow Spectres, both of which are really quite standout strong objective play units with maybe a bit more damage than the Hawks, but they also cost a bit more as well. Next up, for 170 points or 340 for 10, we've got the Wraith Blades. These guys are really quite a tough unit for midfield objective taking. 3 wounds at toughness 7 with a 2+ save and 4+ invulnerable with their shields, and a bunch of ghost axes to strike at strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2. If taking them, I feel like a Spirit Seers basically auto-include, allowing them to hit with a +1 to hit, and also lethal hits is really nice for punching up against vehicles and things, and could be an interesting durability choice, particularly paired with say a -1 to wound from a Farseer nearby. Overall, I feel like they're a pretty reasonable unit to have stomping up to a midfield objective and holding it against all comers. Maybe the main issue is that they're competing against the rather excellent Wraith Guard for that same role. Moving on, we've got the Dire Avengers and their Phoenix Lord Azaman. The Dire Avengers are 14 points each, so 70 points for 5 or 140 for 10 of them. Azaman is 135. The boys in blue I think do a pretty reasonable job of shredding enemy infantry. 3 attacks with lethal hits at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1 is at least fairly general purpose. The auto wounds are definitely helpful against tougher stuff. They could be an okay target for Bladestorm I suppose, and in the enemy turn if they deploy somewhere fairly aggressively, they've got the option for a 4+ overwatch if they're standing within range of an objective marker. Azaman seems like a pretty reasonable include on a maxed out unit. He gets overwatch for 0 CP, which is really quite big. It could basically amount to pretty much a free second round of firepower with him along. And he also has some combat threat with some strength 6 and damage 3 melee with devastating wounds, and a whole bunch of damage 2 shurikens to add to the overwatch fun. Overall really quite solid, though I maybe wouldn't go crazily heavy on them. They could be a candidate to deploy out to a Wave Serpent or something. Next up we have the Shroud Runners, 80 points for 3 of these Ranger jet bikes, 160 points for 6 of them. For their points cost, I really do quite like them as utility jet bikes with a scout booth of 9 inches. Means they can be right deep in the mid-board right from the start of the game, and then they've got a very big movement to potentially get to grips with enemy outlying units and get lines of sight if they need them. Compared with some of the other jet bikes, I feel like they're at least relatively tough for the points, getting stealth for a -1 to hit, a 5+ invulnerable, and having 3 wounds apiece, and then back all of that up with some reasonable enough damage output, a whole bunch of anti-light infantry shots, and a few random sniping shots from the rangers, and they can mark one target nearby for lethal hits for the rest of the army, just being a nice focal gunline damage boost. Overall, I think there's quite a lot to like about them. Probably wouldn't take them in massive great numbers, but for 80 points I feel like they're a unit that's got a whole load of options open to it, including some big things like big early game move blocks and things. I feel like they'll often contribute very positively to winning a mission. Otherwise, for their more standard Guardian counterparts, there are the Wind Riders, 80 points per 3 of them, fast jet bikes with a fair bit of volume fire. Perhaps the Shuriken Cannon might be the most interesting choice of the 3 guns, and they go all in for some fairly punchy damage output, getting to reroll all hit rolls against units that are on objectives. With their damage 2 shots with a bit of AP, they might be a bit more capable at killing things like Space Marines compared with Shroud Runners, and they could be an interesting choice for guarding a Farseer Skyrunner or an Autarch Skyrunner if you want it, and could be a relatively big unit to get some big Eldar synergies going on. You could potentially get a lot of value out of shooting with all of them, and then using something like Fire and Phase to jump behind terrain, perhaps. For 85 points, the Viper is fairly efficient with a single Bright Lance. It means that you can get some pretty maximal rerolls with it, both rerolling the hit roll and the wound roll, and backing that up with some Shuriken fire. It's fairly fast moving and fairly inexpensive, so it could be a bit more sacrificial than some of the other units in the army. And it does help with focal gunline things, as you can target one enemy unit to basically have the benefit of cover removed from it, which could be quite nice to fire earlier in the shooting phase, and then not have to worry about cover for that squad for the rest of your army firing at them. As a result, I think it's a unit that's a bit more sensible to have maybe just one of them in an army rather than loads, and then back it up with other choices. The support weapons are 125 points, and again kind of similar to the Wraith Knight, Games Workshop definitely had these in their crosshairs for big nerfs, and I feel like the nerfs are kind of reasonable for these. They're still in the place where I think that you can play them, though are definitely nowhere near as auto-include as they used to be before. They definitely feel like they're priced for the D cannon out of the 3 loadouts though. The other 2, and particularly the Vibro Cannon, just seem very overcosted as a result. Still though, just with their raw damage output, with Battle Host rerolls, and maybe the odd Farseer Auto 6 Fate dice to punch through some devastating wounds, these guys could be a pretty terrifying area denial threat to any enemy unit that decides to stick itself on an objective, particularly big heavy single targets like monsters and vehicles. The 24-inch range isn't super great, and opponents might be able to avoid it with some things, but provided you've got range on some midfield points, the opponent is going to have to come to you with something. Overall, definitely less auto-include, though still very intimidating, as they can hit you without being hit back. Hornets for 100 points I think are a unit that could have been borderline top of tier 2 or lower tier 1. Just in general, Hornets are really quite nice, fast and focused firepower. It can take dual Bright Lances that make really quite good use of the Aeldari rerolls. It moves 14 inches and has an okay-ish defense at toughness 7 and 8 wounds. There are no invulnerable save or anything like the War Walkers. And if the enemy does get a bit too close, then you've got the potential for at least a fairly good drive-by attack. If you can move over a unit that isn't a vehicle or monster unit, then you get to roll 6 dice at them, and for each 4+ you get a mortal wound, averaging around about 3. Overall, I would say that given the lack of the invulnerable save and no -1 to wounds that the War Walker gets, it's probably a little bit behind it as a result. It does move a bit faster and is a bit cheaper though. Next up, and another unit that could have been a borderline top tier choice, is the Solitaire. 115 points, which is about the most expensive 3 wound character in the game, I think. But he basically is a 3 wound character that's going to reach the enemy before they get to attack him. He's a lone operative that's just got the most ridiculous movement stats ever. A base 12-inch move, and once per game he gets to blitz, increasing his base move by 2d6 inches once per game. So that means that you average a successful charge on a unit that's 26 inches away. When he gets there, on the turn that he blitzes, he'll have 12 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, so that should be a pretty reasonable chance to just utterly wipe out the squad that he contacts. And then hopefully he can just do annoying lone operative things like sit on objectives and hide from enemy shooting, or at least force the enemy to reposition to deal with him. In combat he gets fights first, which will make him annoying to have to kill in melee. He'd get a bunch of attacks before he goes down, and he also has a 3+ invulnerable save as well, which means that while he's only got 3 wounds, he could die to a single hit with quite a lot of heavier weapons. There's always the potential just to luck out and roll a whole bunch of 3+s, and your opponent has to deal with him going on a rampage for another turn. Overall feels like a unit though that is very swingy depending on whether the opponent manages to neutralise him quickly or whether they've got any units that he's not just going to bounce off like monsters and vehicles. With such crazy movement he's going to have a lot of options open to him. I feel like he's going to be one of the models that's perhaps going to be extra nice for a top player that knows the exact right use of him when fighting the enemy army, but probably isn't going to be too rewarding if he just charges in, kills something and then gets killed in return. Next, we've got Eldrad Ulthuan for 110 points. The Farseer of Ulthwé gets you an extra 3 Fate dice to start the game with, which is handy enough, taking your total up to 15 normally. And then his main special rule when he's on the board is Doom for a +1 to wound one enemy unit, but he has to be able to see it and be within 18 inches. Still though, that really is quite a devastating damage buff, perhaps particularly for any units that rely on a whole bunch of volume fire, maybe things like shuriken cannons, or maybe units like fire dragons with their strength 9 guns, or dire avengers with all their strength 4 attacks. He's also got mind war as well, and probably needs some sort of bodyguard to stop him getting shot up too badly. Some guardian defenders seem pretty reasonable for that. Probably not quite as auto-include as regular Farseers given the fate dice manipulation that they do, but still really quite powerful I think. Next up, we've got the regular Autarch for 75 points. He does CP generation on the cheap in a Guardian squad. 75 points for him here versus the much more expensive Autarch Wayleaper. And there is the potential that you could just hide him in strategic reserve for a turn or two and generate the command points off the field, and then just have him come on as a random annoying nuisance threat or to do a secondary or something. He's really quite fragile for the cost, but isn't too bad in terms of damage for a character. He does get some strength 6 damage to attach with his Starglaive, plus maybe a fusion gun as well. I do think his ability to allow a second stratagem for his own unit is a bit on the niche side though, probably not going to be as relevant on things like Guardians versus other stuff. Maybe an extra Phantasm could be kind of big in the right circumstances, I suppose. Finally, for 100 points, we've got Ivrain. Her biggest effect on the game is unlocking Inari if you want to play as them, and allowing you access to a whole bunch of Drukhari units. Things like Ravagers, Void Ravens, or other Drukhari Lance units could be really quite big in the Battle Host attachment. They do get the rerolls from it, so can be quite efficient anti-tank and give you a whole load more options that way. Otherwise, beyond that, I'd say perhaps the single most threatening thing that she does is her Storm of Whispers. Fairly potent, devastating at wound, anti-infantry shooting attack there, plus gives you a 5+ feel no pain and healing for her own unit, though given that she leads Aeldari foot troops, in general it's still probably not going to make the unit overall super tough. I feel like she might be a unit that in general you just want to take to unlock Inari, as that does have some benefits and gives you more choices, and then try and make the best use of her buffs possible, which probably means taking a slightly alternative infantry unit, making them a bit tougher and putting them on the midfield to blow away some light infantry with the devastating wounds. Maybe could be alright in some witches or harlequin troop or something. Finally, last but by no means least, we get to Tier 1. These are the datasheets that I'd rank among the very strongest things that the Aeldari can bring to bear at the moment, and tend to be some of the things that make up the most part of Aeldari competitive lists. First up, and perhaps in pride of place, are the Wraithguard. 170 points for 5 of them, or 340 for 10. These guys are tanky units to hold midfield points, toughness 7, a 2+ armor save and 3 wounds, and typically tend to be fielded with the Wraith Cannons, providing some fairly brutal tank busting damage, strength 14 and damage d6 with devastating wounds there. If they get shot, they've got a special rule to allow them to shoot back, and they don't even have to target the same target, so you could potentially have them in the midfield, take some damage, and then just blast another enemy unit to death. Their range isn't terrible at 18 inches either. With access to Aeldari stratagem support, they've got quite a lot of movement options on offer as well for what's supposed to be a fairly slow unit. Being able to fall back and shoot is also really quite nice. They just miss out on the lightning fast reactions. If you are taking those fairly terrifying Wraithguard, then you're going to be taking a Spirit Seer pretty much. 65 points to give some pretty big damage boost to the unit. Lethal hits is handy enough. That's quite nice for Overwatch as well, but it also gives them a +1 to hit as well, hitting on a 3+ rather than a 4, which is quite a lot more reliable. You also get to revive a dead Wraithguard in your command phase as well, which definitely makes up a big part of the Spirit Seer's point value then and there, getting powerful models back to the board, and it tends to be a particularly popular choice for the Fate's Messenger enhancement as well, flipping 1 dice to an automatic 6 once per turn. That's excellent for saving a Wraithguard's life by taking a powerful weapon shot and turning it into a 6, so you save that save rather than lose it. Also for wound rolls with those Wraith Cannons, getting to lock in some automatic devastating wounds, or even just some auto wounds with the lethal hits. Overall a very strong unit, buffed by a very strong support character. Next up, we've got the Warp Spiders for 115 points or 230 for 10, though people generally tend to field them in the small squads of 5. These guys are pretty much the go-to for a whole bunch of Aeldari objective skirmishing. Really quite fast-moving infantry with their teleport jump packs, and get some nice damage output with their death spinners, getting a whole bunch of torrent auto hits at some medium strength, but perhaps most importantly getting devastating wounds on all that, so it means that they're almost guaranteed to strip off at least a little bit of damage against any targets that they get their webs on. Perhaps the craziest thing about their datasheet though is their 24-inch flicker jump move that they can do. If they don't want to charge and they can risk taking a mortal wound, they get to move just 24 inches in the movement phase, which is pretty godly for being able to do secondary objectives. You could jump straight into the opponent's backfield like that, or jump to the corners of the board, or be able to get some lines of sight on enemy units that should all rights be hidden. It's some pretty godly movement potential that could potentially have some line of sight on the things they most need to hit, and also hopefully stay safe from enemy reprisals somewhat. They're perhaps even nastier given the other options for all the battle host movement shenanigans that they can do. Perhaps the other really common objective skirmishing Eldari unit are the Shadow Spectres from Forge World. 95 points for 5 of them, usually just 5s, though you can upgrade to 10 of them or take an Exarch, and per point their defense isn't maybe too terrible for Eldari, a 3+ save with a 5+ invulnerable plus stealth, so a -1 to hit at range, and most importantly the ability to move, shoot, move. So hopefully most of the time the opponent can't draw a line of sight to them anyway, as they could pop out of terrain, fire off their prismatic shooting, and then jump back to safety. The damage output's quite versatile as well. If they want to kill light infantry, then they've got a blast attack, or if they want to kill heavies, then they each get a single strength 6, AP 2, and damage 3 attack. That's a very nasty profile for taking down things like Terminators. And again, like the Warp Spiders, with their good movement and the extra 6-inch move that they can get after they've made a shooting attack, they just go very, very quickly around the board, can get where they need to score points for secondaries, while hopefully also dealing damage while staying safe. And again, loads of good options for things like reactive moves and things with the Eldari battle host stratagems. If the opponent does ever get line of sight on them, they might even be able to phantasm to safety. Should it make sense for some reason, both they and the Warp Spiders can deep strike as well, though with great movement it might make more sense to start on the board a lot of the time. More heavy Eldari firepower next, and next up is the Fire Prism for 180 points. Kind of ludicrous that these started more like the 125 point mark when the edition came out, and they're still considered a pretty strong choice and one of the top armies at this sort of level. The Fire Prisms get 2 scary anti-tank shots with strength 18, AP -4 and flat damage 6. The crystal targeting matrix builds in rerolls to them, and between that and the battle host rerolls it means that you can always reroll all hits and wounds with that, so very, very reliable. Then multiple Fire Prisms can all draw line of sight via one of them that they can see, so you could have a battery of 3 of them and they both draw line of sight from the one exposed one. Means that you could potentially keep 2 of them safe and play aggressive with one of them, zooming it down a flank to hit something key, or you can play very conservatively with all of them, just nose one of them just out of cover, and then if the opponent can draw line of sight with anything else you could fire and fade back to safety. It's quite nice that they can be dedicated anti-tank and still not be useless in a Horde type matchup, as they can trade out to the disperse strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2 shots if it makes more sense, and later in the game they can move very quickly to get lines of sight on what they need to with a big 14-inch move. Overall still very nasty indeed, probably still a unit that you probably either take 2 or 3 of or none though, just to make use of that great line of sight rule. Warwalkers perhaps seem to be the bright lance delivery unit of choice at the moment. 110 points for a little scout walker like this, usually packing 2 bright lances, and as always making great use of the battle roast rerolls there. These guys, despite being walkers, still are pretty fast. They can scout 9 inches and then have a 10-inch move after that. It means that in the first round of the game they should be in either a good position to strike or should be nice and safe behind cover that they've moved to. Could be quite nasty for enemies going into that, and even if they can be shot, given that they've only got a 6 wound profile, they're surprisingly tanky. Toughness 7, a 4+ invulnerable save, and a -1 to wound against ranged weapons is all rather good. It means a lot of anti-tank firepower is going to be surprisingly ineffective against them. High AP doesn't exactly count for much. Perhaps one of the single most ubiquitous and auto-include units of the Aeldari is the Night Spinner. Usually around about 1 to 3 of these does tend to crop up in the strongest Aeldari lists around. It was one of the strongest units before and only got a very light points tap when the adjustments happened. The Night Spinner gets d6+3 shots at strength 7, AP 0 and damage 2, or with twin linked and devastating wounds, usually meaning that you get around about 1 devastating wound on every target that you hit, though of course that is kind of swingy. If they've got a Farseer nearby, then you can get a lot more reliability. Feeding in an auto 6 fate dice means that you could have on average 2 devastating wounds, and it often means that, say, between 2 Night Spinners and a Farseer, you could have a pretty reasonable chance of wiping out, say, a squad of Space Marines that was hiding out of line of sight. Quite nice for objective work. Depending on the matchup, it can be just as important for the special rule as well. The Night Spinner special rule gives you a -2 inch to move and prevents the unit that they targeted advancing, which, if the opponent's got at least a fairly slow moving, maybe short ranged or melee unit, could just completely keep a unit out of the game. Perhaps particularly nasty in context of Aeldari, who are going to be able to outmaneuver you anyway, and might well be hiding behind lines of sight blocking walls that the Night Spinner could stop you from getting around by debuffing movement. Overall, just absolutely brutally strong. Not too surprising to see why you might have a few of these hovering in the backfield, and later in the game they could even play a bit more aggressive, zooming out with a good movement to get lines of sight and inflict more damage per point, or even push up to get maximal things on objectives if they need it. Next up, we've got the Avatars. I think that previously the Incarn might have been rated again one of the single strongest Aeldari units before the nerfs, but it did get one of the most solid nerfs out of any of the ones that they had in the balanced data slate, going up to a cool 350 points. The big dangerous Aeldari god of death is still absolutely terrifying to fight though. Some fairly strong melee that's going to be effective against the majority of targets that it fights, and a fairly nice torrent attack with strength 7, AP 1 and damage D3. The Avatars are both really quite tough. The Incarn's got T10, 12 wounds, a 2+ save, and a 4+ invulnerable, and a nice rule that allows it to half damage, and you could layer other defensive buffs on it like a Farseer's -1 to wound. The single biggest thing for the Incarn though is its jumping around the board when units die. That can be absolutely brutal for the opponent to play against, and it can have some pretty big target priority implications. Means that you could have it jump to some very threatening locations or jump away from harm and go back to somewhere safe. You've got the option for whether you want to reposition it whenever one of your units dies. Following the points changes, I feel like the Avatar of Cain is a lot more balanced against it now. 335 points, so a little bit cheaper. Doesn't come with the big movement tricks, but just has more raw might. It's got 14 wounds, a massive toughness of 12, and stronger melee than the Incarn, just ruining huge targets. As well as that, it's got a handy enough aura of +1 to advance and charge, which is probably helpful for the Avatar itself more than anything else. Could be useful for Wraith Blades or something in a pinch perhaps. And then the Wailing Doom shooting attack probably shouldn't be underestimated either. Really quite a scary melter style attack. There's perhaps a particularly interesting choice for Overwatch and then feeding in an automatic 6 fate dice where you can pretty much guarantee landing one very powerful anti-tank hit. Could be pretty ruinous on something that lacks an invulnerable save. Overall quite nice to see Kalamensha Kane having the desired effect on the battlefield. The Autarch Wayleaper is 115 points. Again, he took a massive points increase, but still seems to be very playable. Basically doing Autarch things and rustling up command points. He'll farm you one whether he's on or off the board and in strategic reserve, and then whether he turns up or has been jumping around the backfield already, he's a fast moving lone operative, which is generally handy to have for secondary objectives and things. And being unable to be shot outside of 12 inches, that should often mean that if he does want to commit to the fight, he should get the jump on the opponent, maybe hitting them with a fusion gun and a star glaive before they get to react in return. Could be an interesting enough choice for the Phoenix gem if you really wanted to go all in on a big disruptive lone operative character. Could be quite a big deal for if the opponent ever does manage to catch up with him and kill him, that he just gets back up when he's dead for the first time. Next we've got the Farseers. Both the regular one and the Skyrunner I think are really quite playable. The regular one's 80 points and the Skyrunner's 90 points, and they both share a couple of special rules, the main one being flipping fate dice to an automatic 6 if you happen to use one within a unit within 6 inches once per turn. Really quite nice to basically get some actual good use out of the lower roll fate dice, and maybe some of the best uses might be for feeding in automatic devastating wounds, perhaps with Night Spinners or with Wraith Guard, or even the really big stuff like the Wraith Knight Heavy Wraith Cannon, blasting straight through the highest saves and vehicle invulnerables. It's really nasty for Overwatch as well, where you could auto hit with an anti-tank weapon, say like the Avatar of Cain, or maybe Fugan as we'll get onto. And it's very nice for saving throws as well, as you can basically guarantee that you save one important shot. Could be a big deal if your opponent was hitting you with something very high power, say maybe something like an enemy Bright Lance or Fire Prism perhaps. Then beyond that, Eldritch Storm chips in some okay anti-elite damage at range. Definitely doesn't hurt to have a bunch more strength 6 and multi-damage attacks. And then finally on top of that, the Footseer gives one unit a -1 to wound. Pretty excellent with tough stuff like Wraith Guard or maybe an Avatar or a Wraith Knight. And the Skyrunner one goes on the offensive a bit more, using Guide for full hit rerolls for a unit. Again, very nasty on the biggest, scariest units around. Overall, absolutely loads of value for the points cost here. The Auto 6 and both of the buffs are really quite standout for the points, and a bit of Eldritch Storm is definitely not unhelpful. Next up, Fugan's a rather interesting unit that seems to have been running around in competitive lists solo quite a bit. I can't help but think that's probably not the role that Games Workshop had in mind for him versus leading his Fire Dragons, but overall it looks like he does just have enough damage, particularly with his Seer Song Fire Pike, to make himself worth it for that role on the table. If Seer Song can get within Melter range, then it can spit out a Strength 14 damage d6 plus 6 shot, a pretty reasonable chance to just destroy an enemy tank in a single attack, and again that could be kind of interesting with Overwatch as well if you have something in range. It's also got a beam profile that's a bit better for Space Marine killing. That one gets you sustained hits d3 on a 6, so again it's very interesting for an automatic fate dice there. It's got some alright melee in combat, with 6 attacks at strength 5, AP 4, damage 3, and it has some respectable enough defense for a character. Basically like a normal Phoenix Lord with 5 wounds, a 4+ invulnerable save, a 2+ save, but he also has a 5+ feel no pain as well. Perhaps the thing that does make him a bit more reliable for being run independently is his gets up on death rule. The first time that he's killed, he gets to set up on a 2+ with his 4 wounds remaining, which basically means that overall the opponent's likely to have to chew through around about 15 wounds worth of Fugans to remove him from the board once you've accounted for the feel no pain. It also means that he can't be removed in a single shooting phase as well for the most part, so there's every chance that you just knock him down, then he just gets back up and comes back swinging. Overall kind of fun, really quite interesting to see a bit of hero hammer going on there. Next we've got the Death Jester for 90 points, again another annoying lone operative here who could be handy for secondary things or standing on home field objectives and being unable to be shot. His primary attack is a shuriken cannon with a choice of special rules, potentially sustained hits, lethal hits, or picking up precision to snipe characters. He could be another good choice for Fate's Messenger if you're not using it elsewhere, as you could use that to automatically trigger a sustained hits 3 for him. It means that you'd usually get about 5 hits out of that devastating wound Shrieker cannon, or you could punch through an automatic devastating wound when you're firing with precision, which could make him really quite a grave threat to enemy characters. Finally, last but by no means least, we've got the Rangers and Illic. Rangers are just 55 points for a unit of 5 of them, making them one of the nicely cheap and expendable units out of the Eldar index when they don't have all that many. 55 points I think is just really quite nice value for an infiltrating unit that you can set up the board, start them on a midfield objective perhaps, and force the opponent to move things out to try and trade with them. And even then they've got a reactive move if the opponent gets too close, which could be quite a big deal in just keeping them safe from the enemy trying to hit them. For defense for Eldar, they aren't the worst. I think it's reasonable enough for 11 points really. They get a 5+ invulnerable save and stealth, still not super tough by any means, but does mean that they should need a little bit more small arms fire than some of the other Eldar units to bring down for the cost. Then finally, to lead the Rangers, Illic Nightspear is a pretty reasonable choice if you want to go high investment for them. He grants lone operative style protection to Rangers to make for one very safe objective. Could make them just a very problematic unit to try and catch up with properly between that and the Rangers' reactive move rule. On top of that, he takes the Rangers' sniper damage from being maybe a little bit on the trivial side to something genuinely quite scary. He gets a great big strength 6, AP 3 and damage 3 shot himself, which he could use a fate dice to get some devastating wounds on, or just embrace the big rerolls from the battle host. He makes the rest of the Rangers reroll wound rolls with their regular rifles as well, which should make them a lot more of a threat than they'd otherwise be, particularly against toughness 5 or above. Overall, this could be another annoying lone operative unit for 125 points, and one that is actually going to contribute to the game as well, gunning down enemy leaders. So anyway, with Illic and the Rangers done, I believe that just about brings us to the end of our look at all the Aeldari datasheets, and all the various ways and tricks that the Space Elves have to lay you low. Loads of nasty tricks when all put together to get the jump on the foe, keep them at arm's length, and potentially hit them very hard with anti-tank fire. Seems that they're on track to remain one of the strongest armies out there, at least until the next balanced data slate, where I probably wouldn't be too surprised if Games Workshop doubled down with a few more nerfs for them, probably mainly falling on the top tier units. Let me know your thoughts on the tier list in any case. I'm fully happy to hear any recommendations as to things that you might have ranked a little bit higher or lower. With such a vast array of Space Elf nastiness on the table, I'm sure there's a few things that perhaps could be rated higher or lower. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, including new ones coming out just about every day. I'm sure we'll cycle back to the Aeldari at some point in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. If you have been finding these useful, then any support on the Patreon page is enormously appreciated. It is the thing that allows me to keep on making big projects like this happen. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.